This story will tell us about brave warriors who were called raiders for their craft. They were the ones who hunted the various monsters that were bothering and harassing the locals. As a reward for this, the daredevils received recognition, fame, and of course, money. They were considered to be the ones who protect people from evil monsters who were always trying to take advantage of their weakness and attack. Although the work was quite dangerous, the raiders were considered real heroes. And as we know, heroism does not live without envy. To be a raider means to be someone who makes people's hearts beat faster. But few people know what makes the raider's heart beat faster, and what consequences accompany this. Only one thing could bring the brave warrior to such a state, namely, the understanding that death was already very close. This is the only thing that made the people's favorite and hero stop and feel how fear, along with blood, fills his veins. The cafe was surprisingly quiet, as if the bustle of the city could not penetrate the premises through the huge panoramic windows. But suddenly, an indignant cry disturbed this peaceful atmosphere, causing the visitors to turn around indignantly in search of the source of the noise. The guy sitting at the table slammed his fist so loudly that his drink almost spilled on the table, but he didn't pay attention to it and asked his interlocutor if he really wanted to make a human shield out of him. The man sitting opposite him raised his hand in a conciliatory manner and with a hint of alarm urged his interlocutor to take this information more easily, since the guy himself had said that he needed money. The guy was silent for a second, thinking about what he had heard, and realized that it was not surprising that this man was luring him into raiding the dungeon. The man's name was Young Woo Min, and he worked for a raider agency that was in charge of giving jobs to loners like this guy. When Young Woo Min called him, the guy thought that he had finally come across a profitable deal that would help solve his financial problems. But when he heard that he was offered to stand in the vanguard during the clearing of the Dungeon of the Dead, he was extremely disappointed, because he did not want to go to slaughter like some kind of meat. The guy thought sadly that life had been unfair to him, because even guys who were lower in rank than him found much better offers. Chung Woo Min sensed this disappointment in his interlocutor's eyes and sympathized with him, so he had a desire to somehow console his potential employee. The man said that regardless of rank, raiders of combat classes are rarely given tasks, to which the guy only smiled sadly and asked if he was really being refused because of his class. He ironically apologized for being so useless, but Young Woo Min couldn't console him, because in fact, that was exactly how it was, because recently, magicians had occupied all the workplaces. The employer explained that everyone else found work with varying success, since soldiers were much more often injured, and because of this they were avoided so as not to bother with compensation. This was the reality, as mages could fight monsters by keeping them at a distance, thus preventing them from harming themselves, and also excelled in teamwork. Warriors were very different from them because they mainly fought in close combat and received much more injuries in battles. The boy understood all this, and although he didn't know how things were 10 years ago, now he saw that there seemed to be no place for raiders of his class anywhere. Probably it was necessary to become a mage. 11 years ago, he had a good result in the identification of predispositions, thanks to which he was able to enter a professional academy for training raiders called Milas. The guy's magical abilities also increased to 97%, which was almost equal to Song Ina, who was at the peak of her magical skills, possessing 92%, which made the guy's performance incredible. Despite the fact that his predisposition to martial arts was only 34%, the guy still chose the path of a warrior for himself, although there was no good reason for this. It's just that at that moment, his personal assessment of the magicians was quite categorical. He thought that their ranks consisted of worthless buffers who, without the support of warriors, could not kill even a cockroach. But now everything was exactly the opposite. The boy sadly thought about whether his life would have been better if he had chosen the path of a magician rather than a warrior. Usually, a raider's development stopped at the age of 20, so there was no point in regretting the past, since nothing would change anyway. The employer turned to Hyun, who was sitting opposite him, saying that such an opportunity doesn't come along often, and that he could offer this job to others. But knowing his problems, he immediately came to the guy. Hyun angrily slammed his fist on the table, remembering the time when his talent made magicians jealous, but now he was a worthless D-rank warrior. He realized with disappointment that the difference between his past and present was too great. Therefore, Hyun accepted Young Woo Min's offer, which caused the man to look at him with confusion. They sat in silence for a while, because the guy didn't want to admit even to himself that he had no choice in the first place. He clearly understood that in order to survive in this swamp, he could not refuse even such work. The guy was pulled out of his depressive thoughts by the joyful voice of Young Woo Min, who convinced him that he was doing the right thing. The man said that they should meet at 7:30, which surprised the guy, because he thought that young Woo Min had too many things to do and had no time for meetings. Hyun said that there was no need to waste his time on him and insisted that the man calmly go about his business. But young Woo Min smiled and said in a friendly manner that he also needed to be at the gathering place, which he would announce a little later. The next day, many raiders gathered at the designated place in a clearing near a tree, in the roots of which was a portal. Hyun leaned against a tree with a bored expression and watched the commotion created by all the people gathered. From time to time, he glanced at his phone, expecting that young Woo Min, who had promised to come, would at least send him a message, but nothing happened. The guy closed his eyes and thought with annoyance that the man could have said right away that he wouldn't come. Then he wouldn't have built up vain expectations. This situation upset him greatly and made him consider himself not a strong and promising warrior, since they didn't want to waste time on him. Looking at the men sitting nearby, Hyun thought that it would have been much more profitable for Jung Woo Min to work with more capable raiders. After all, the guy was only a D rank, so he wasn't someone you could place high bets on. After all, he was now surrounded by much stronger warriors, such as A-rank mages and the like. Hyun wondered why Jung Woo Min needed this raider bureau. He could join any guild, so it was strange that he was wasting his time in such a place. The guy's thoughts were interrupted by an ominous whisper that he had been hearing in his head since the moment he arrived at the raiders' meeting place. This whisper became louder and more intrusive. It kept repeating that the guy was nothing but trash. Hyun tried to ignore the voice that was spinning around in his head, but it was hard to concentrate when even his own mind was telling him that he wasn't worthy of a respected place in society. The guy's inner voice was distracted by the real one, which belonged to the man who called him by his full name, Jae-hyun. The fair-haired warrior smiled affably and waved his hand, showing with his whole appearance that he was glad to meet him. The guy was surprised to see Myung-ho Hyun, but he said that recently there was too little work, and although this business was dangerous, it paid a decent amount. Jae-hyun bowed his head, agreeing that this order could bring in a good salary. Myung-ho Hyun said that their brother had nowhere else to work except here, in his opinion, people no longer had a passion for martial arts. They preferred to shoot fireballs from behind their comrades. The guy didn't answer, but he thought to himself that he wasn't interested in passion because now he was literally dying of hunger. The blonde warrior didn't notice any changes in the guy's behavior, so he said that they needed to do everything well, and when the work was finished, he suggested they pop a bottle of soju. Jae-hyun looked at him tiredly and said without much enthusiasm that it was not a bad idea. Only he had problems with money, which he told his brother, but Myung-ho Hyun shook his head and said that he paid last time. Jae-hyun smiled shyly and rubbed his neck while looking at the ground, clearly ignoring his brother's probing gaze. Myung-ho Hyun realized that he would have to pay again, so he gave in and said that he would pay for the soju they drank together. He cleared his throat, as if trying to look more important, and said that this was the last time he would sponsor their joint entertainment. Watching this spectacle, the guy laughed and said that he felt somehow uncomfortable being in his debt again, but to himself he thought that this guy was a simpleton. The conversation was interrupted by a loud shout from a man who was standing right next to the portal and announced that everyone should gather at the entrance to the dungeon. A tall man in dark glasses announced that the raiders would be entering the location in half an hour. One could hear the crowd begin to sigh and talk apprehensively, hoping to learn more about the task that lay ahead. Such pessimistic sentiment slightly confused both Jae-hyun and his relative, who were watching the crowd's unrest. In order not to show his worries, Myung-ho Hyun said in a businesslike tone that it was time to get ready to fulfill the order. Jae-hyun didn't answer again, but only looked away thoughtfully, showing with his whole appearance that he wasn't in the mood for conversation right now. He checked his phone's messages once again and sighed in disappointment when he didn't find a single notification from Jung Woo Min. The guy began to think about how, during campaigns, a raider needed to remember that blind luck was a very dangerous ally, just like luck, which was capable of inspiring any of the warriors, but it paralyzes the brain and becomes fatal carelessness. There is no need to neglect attentiveness, because the moment a person stops soberly assessing the situation, the worst thing happens. The dungeon, without wasting time, immediately begins to test the raiders' strength, trying to find out how strong the opponents who entered it are. And then there was only one question left. What the raider now had was luck or a tragedy hidden behind it. The guy was pulled out of his reverie by his relative, who asked why he was stuck in one place and not going to the entrance to the dungeon. Myung-ho Hyun asked laughingly why he was staring at his phone again. The man noticed that the guy always did this before going out, so he asked if he was really looking so engrossed in the photo of his girlfriend. Jaehyun just chuckled at the suggestion and said that there was nothing important on his phone. As soon as his annoying relative turned away, the guy's gaze fell again on the mobile phone screen, and a soft smile appeared on his face. The photo showed Jaehyun and a woman standing next to him, smiling sweetly and hugging his hand. The guy muttered a promise to his mother that he would return to her soon. Turning off the phone and putting it in the pocket of his pants, the guy headed towards the portal that would lead him straight to the dungeon. When they entered, they found themselves in a strange place, which was illuminated by a greenish flame and cast eerie reflections on the walls and the people standing there. But as they got closer, the raiders realized that in front of them were not people, but monsters that were advancing on them with open mouths full of sharp teeth. One of the warriors ordered the vanguard to hold their shields tight and maintain a line so as not to let the monsters get too close. Jaehyun was outraged by the tone of this man, who continued to give orders and say that the vanguard must hold the line even on the brink of life and death. When the paw of one of the monsters almost touched Jaehyun's neck, he suddenly realized that he had almost no strength left to hold back the enemy's onslaught. Behind them, the sound of the mages chanting could be heard, calling upon the shining light of Alfheim and the fierce flames of Surt to destroy their enemies. The world behind Jaehyun began to glow, and the hands of the magicians were filled with the flames of the deity and the fire giant Surt. The boy took another look behind him and saw that the light of blue and yellow shades merged together to destroy the common enemy. The fire rushed straight at the vanguard standing in front, but did not cause it the slightest harm, affecting only the monsters, who did not slow down the onslaught. The flames began to consume the vile creatures, causing them to scream in pain and writhe in their death throes. Jaehyun watched in surprise and a hint of fear as what was left of the once human-like monsters burned before him. The boy couldn't watch as the fire consumed the bodies of these creatures, so he turned away and chose not to see what was happening right before his eyes. He remembered that this guild of rookie mages that was quickly gaining popularity was called Meteor. Taking a look at these self-confident mages, Jaehyun realized that no matter how much he liked them, he most likely wouldn't die with them. When the carnage was over, the raiders dispersed to different sides of this strange dungeon to at least somehow catch their breath after what they had seen. Myung-ho-hyun coughed after taking another sip of the strong drink that was in his glass, and then laughed at his clumsiness. The man sighed and turned to Jaehyun and asked if they really only had to go through the room with the boss now. While looking through some information on his tablet, he said that if he had known how hard it would be now, he would have trained more when he was younger and raised his level. Jaehyun countered by saying that the man was still as fresh as a cucumber, as he was a level higher than him and had quite good skills. The relative asked the guy if he had knocked out any items, because good things could be found in this dungeon since it was A rank. Jaehyun replied that he wasn't sure if he found anything, but he still looked at his tablet, wanting to check if he had found anything valuable. The guy was focused on clicking on various areas located on the tablet screen, trying to find something useful. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the fact that the device began to behave strangely and stopped following his commands. The device's screen began to ripple and disintegrate into many small pictures that showed nothing but a bluish light. Jaehyun was completely confused and at a loss, because he didn't know what to do with it and how to return his work tablet to its original state. After several minutes of unsuccessfully struggling with the technical device, the guy desperately put his hand to his head and tried to figure out what he should do. He didn't understand what caused such a strange breakdown, because he didn't do anything new with his tablet, and it was unclear what had just happened. A few moments later, a graph appeared on the device's screen, indicating that the Escher system was no longer working, and that communication with the user had been lost. It was very strange, because this had never happened before, and now, for an unknown reason, the launch of the Escher system was cancelled, and the guy did not understand what this even meant. As the raider tried to think about the situation, small flashes of light flared up around him, and he heard a quiet whisper that told him to follow this glow. This strange phenomenon seriously scared Jaehyun, because now you are immersed in your own thoughts, and a second later some whisper appears in your head, calling you to certain actions. The boy watched with apprehension as new information began to appear on the screen, stating that an unknown object had invaded the Escher system and that safe mode restoration had been cancelled. He tried hard to understand what this unknown object was and whose voice he had just heard right in his brain, but the strangest thing for him was the call to follow the light, because he even became interested in where this radiance would lead. Perhaps it was a clue to who the voice belonged to. Jaehyun was distracted from these thoughts by Myung-ho-hyun, who approached him and began to ask what he was muttering in complete solitude. The boy looked gloomily at his relative, who always came at the wrong moment, and said that he had not said anything, But to his great surprise, Myung-ho-hyun repeated his phrase, which was to follow the light, meaning that he was involuntarily speaking his thoughts out loud. When the boy looked at the man again, instead of his face, he saw a bright ball of light that attracted all his attention and prevented him from concentrating on anything else. Jae-hyun looked around anxiously and discovered that the entire space of the dungeon was filled with similar balls of light that were floating in the air. The fact that strange, glowing objects were hovering around caused the guy no small surprise. But what was even stranger was that it seemed like the people around him didn't notice anything. Questions kept running through his head about what this light was, why he had to follow it, and where it would lead. All this time, Myung-ho-hyun had been observing his relative's strange behavior, so he worriedly assumed that perhaps he had a fever. Jae-hyun was so lost in his thoughts that he seemed to hear his brother from somewhere far away, but he still replied that he was okay. Continuing to watch the light, which had now formed into a small path, the guy finally realized that only he and no one else could see it. This realization struck Jae-hyun because the dungeon was not ordinary and everything in it had meaning, so he decided that he needed to check where this light path would lead. Myung-ho-hyun asked Jae-hyun with a worried voice where he was going, but he only replied that he would be back in a few minutes. The boy was so absorbed in his thoughts about the glowing spheres that he completely ignored what was happening around him and didn't even look at his brother when he answered him. Wanting to figure out what was going on, he went to a remote corner of the dungeon, where the spheres were becoming larger and brighter. Jae-hyun tried to touch one of the bright balls, but before his hand could touch the phenomenon, it immediately dissipated, as if it had never existed at all. He then opened the tablet again, hoping that it would work, but only saw an information window that said the system was not working, and that the specifications could not be loaded. The guy got even more confused when he saw a new notification that a feature corruption had been detected, and a safe mode recovery had been launched. He focused his gaze on the flame and thought about how he had been awakened since he was 10 years old, and that in all these years the system had never failed. There had been no damage or restoration. Jae-hyun decided that all these strange things were connected to the voice he heard in his head, so he wanted to figure out what it all meant. The guy began to analyze what had happened, starting with the penetration of the unknown object into the Ashir system and its subsequent collapse. He also did not ignore the voice he heard throughout his entire stay in the dungeon, ordering him to follow the light. Going deeper and deeper into the depths of the dungeon, the guy thought that perhaps all these events meant some changes. It only remained to find out whether they were for the better or for the worse. The name of the Ashir system comes from the word Asa, which was used to refer to the gods of Asgard, Odin, and Thor, and this invention was the last hope of humanity. It happened 20 years ago, in a year that was rich in various disasters that harmed people. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a tree of unimaginable size grew, and when it opened its buds, in just 9 days it covered the entire sky with its leaves. Some people and wise men said that this was a harbinger of the apocalypse, and that a real nightmare would soon begin on Earth. Others were inclined to think that this tree was a blessing from God, and that now life would begin to improve, and the planet would prosper. In reality, this phenomenon was nothing other than Yggdrasil, the world tree spoken of in ancient myths and legends. On the 9th day, when the tree's growth had ended, the earth was engulfed in fires, and an invasion of various monsters began, which began to commit their atrocities. Many people were doomed to die at the hands of the monsters and be torn to pieces by their sharp teeth and claws, while the survivors were doomed to suffer from hunger and plague. Seeing how the creatures that mercilessly killed everyone indiscriminately were rampaging on the streets of their hometowns, people fell into despair. But soon, the people had a glimmer of hope, which was embodied in a man who could help deal with the invasion of monsters. The bloodthirsty monsters were eager to put an end to the potential threat to their existence. But for them, everything was not so simple. This man possessed unique abilities that helped him fight the various enemies that came to their world with the advent of Yggdrasil. This is how the world learned about the appearance of the first awakened one, because no one had previously been able to resist these creatures. This awakened one possessed the power of God, and by showing that it was possible to fight the invasion of enemies, he lit a spark of hope in the hearts of people. As the number of awakened increased, they split into different groups, including raiders who professionally hunted monsters. Around the same time, the Ashir system was created, which is a powerful weapon and is controlled by awakened people. Jae-hyun thought that when such a stable and constant system experiences such disruptions or changes, it is difficult to think optimistically. While the guy was thinking about this, he didn't notice how he approached the large lights that illuminated the space. filling it with an eerie greenish light. These lights illuminated the massive door, on which various drawings of monsters were depicted, and the guy froze, not knowing whether he should go further. Taking a closer look at the huge door, Jae-hyun suddenly realized where it led, and couldn't help but let out a sigh of delight, because he didn't believe that all of this was real. The symbols on the door indicated that in front of the boy was nothing more than a gate that led to the treasures that could be heard about in legends. The gate to treasures was a hidden room that appeared extremely rarely, and could only be found in high-ranking dungeons, as it contained special and very rare items. Jae-hyun walked up to the door and smiled in anticipation, because the cost of one item from such a treasure could exceed several hundred won, and he really needed money right now. He suddenly realized that if he could find an item of Class A or higher, he could say goodbye to the dark days of his life. Jae-hyun suddenly felt a strong sense of anxiety, so he closed his eyes and turned to the Almighty, saying that if he existed, then let him send him an item of Class A or higher. Having offered this prayer, he opened his eyes and resolutely pushed open the door, mentally preparing himself for what awaited him inside the hidden room. The atmosphere of the room was completely different from the dungeon, because behind the door it was quiet and cozy. Soft, warm light filled the space, and stars were visible through the tall columns. Slowly entering the spacious hall, Jae-hyun saw that in the center of the room there was a raised platform on which some object was located and was shining brightly. It was surprising to the guy that there was such a large space inside the hidden room, which meant that what they were talking about on television was not an empty fiction. Coming closer and closer to the column, which was located in the center of the hall, one could finally make out a spherical object that blinded with its radiance. The guy was happy, because if this thing had the ability to emit such light, then perhaps it was of a high enough rank that it would help him get out of the financial hole. Jae-hyun realized that he didn't want to stand there and wonder what was in front of him, so he gathered his courage and walked closer to see how useful the find was. He reached out and touched the ball, which felt like a small, warm light bulb that could warm you from the inside and replenish all your internal resources. The guy immediately felt how the tablet with the Escher system came to life, and displayed information that some of the functions had been restored, and a new piece of equipment had been received. But the good news does not come alone, because the piece of equipment received was the lost eye of Odin, with which one can study runes, reverse magic, or destroy it. Jae-hyun couldn't believe that he now possessed the only item in the world that was classified as a mythical class, so he rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the illusion. But when he opened his eyes again, the information about the object had not disappeared, but only revealed even more details about what abilities the owner of Odin's eye would have. The boy remembered that, out of all the items he sold at auction, the best one was the C-class. It quickly went for tens of billions of won as soon as he registered it. Magic items could be priced independently, but for a mythical class, one could get an unimaginable amount of money, because the item was the only one of its kind. Jae-hyun was thrilled to realize that he would no longer have to work hard to feed himself, the guilds would no longer ignore him, and he would no longer have to be cannon fodder in the dungeons. The boy was blinded by joy, so he decided that since Odin's eye now belonged to him, why not try it on himself and feel this power while there was still an opportunity. He looked at this little thing that beckoned him, and decided that he would wear it just once before selling it at auction. But suddenly an announcement appeared in front of him that when used, the item is assigned to the user, so the guy decided that he would not touch the eye so as not to ruin anything. Jae-hyun thought that there was no need to activate the item, since if he sold it on the black market, he could earn hundreds of billions of won. Getting that kind of money was a higher priority for him, because after 20 years, he could no longer raise his level, and he had no desire to continue getting dirty in the dungeons. The guy took Odin's lost eye, and decided that this thing would definitely bring him benefit in the form of a large amount of currency. He did not see any other value in the mythical find. The system collapse was an anomaly, and a change that no one expected, but Jae-hyun had long been accustomed to such occurrences, because once the dungeons became a reality, incidents for raiders ceased to be a rare occurrence. Unforeseen situations usually resulted in either luck or tragedy, so the guy decided not to linger in the hidden room and return to the rest of the raiders. At this time, Myung-ho-hyun tried his best to somehow justify Jae-hyun's absence to those who led this expedition into the dungeon, saying that the guy went off on his own business and would appear any minute. He tried to prove to the magician standing in front of him that it was worth waiting for his relative just a little longer, when suddenly the man saw that the missing guy had finally returned. Jae-hyun walked straight towards them, not in a hurry at all, as if the mages and the entire raider squad weren't waiting for him to continue their mission. Myung-Go-hyun began to hurry him, telling him to quicken his pace since they had to finish their adventures in the dungeon. The guy apologized to the magician for being late and promised to be careful in the future, because the magician began a lecture about how one cannot act rashly in their situation. Jae-hyun looked at the departing mage with annoyance and thought that it was unfair that these arrogant individuals were commanding them and managing the mission. Seeing the boy's bad mood, Myung-Ho-hyun patted him on the shield and told him in a soft tone not to be upset by the mage's words. Jae-hyun smiled at the gesture as he was pleased with the man's support, so he said that he was okay. As he left, he said that they would drink soju at his expense tonight, since he couldn't be a freeloader all the time, and these words caused a wave of surprise in the man. Myung-Ho-hyun looked at his relative with bewilderment and rubbed the back of his head, wondering if the guy had gone crazy at the age of 27. Once Jae-hyun stepped aside and wasn't surrounded by annoying people, he realized that he was lucky to get by without any unnecessary explanations for his absence. He understood that they were inside a dungeon, where there was no law or rules, and everything that happened would remain within these damp and gloomy walls. Therefore, bragging about having found an expensive thing was tantamount to suicide, because there will always be those who want to take away an expensive thing and appropriate it for themselves. It would be wise to sell Odin's eye after the raid was over, because the most important thing now was not to attract unnecessary attention to his person. The mage who was in charge of organizing the raid said that since the formation had been reorganized, they could continue their mission, but suddenly, his voice died down, as if he sensed something was wrong. A second later, an unexpected situation really happened, because the entire cave began to shake, and stones began to fall from the ceiling. Jae-hyun's eyes widened in surprise, because he didn't know what to do if they suddenly got trapped under a rubble. It would be very difficult to get out of the cave if the entrance to it was buried under a pile of stones. Following the scattering of small stones, large boulders began to fall from the ceiling, trying to crush those who did not manage to jump back in time. Jae-hyun barely managed to jump away from the rock that was flying straight at him. He avoided the blow, but lost his balance and rolled to the side, trying to avoid another collapse. He lay on the damp floor and tried to cough, because the fall knocked almost all the air out of his lungs. The guy did not understand what was happening at all, and how this rockfall happened. But these were not all the strange things that the raiders had to endure, because now the gloomy space of the cave was filled with a strange purple smoke. Those who inhaled these vapors immediately began to cough, because this smoke burned the lungs very badly and displaced all the air from the body. The guy quickly realized that only poisonous smoke had this effect, so he immediately covered his airways with his palm. The poisonous purple smoke burned not only the lungs, but also the eyes, which were terribly watery, and prevented them from seeing the road that would help them get out of this cave alive. Through the haze and tears, Jae-hyun managed to see his brother, who, covering his mouth, was able to mumble to him that they needed to run, because the smoke was very dangerous. Myung-Ho-hyun began to loudly tell everyone who could hear him that they needed to get out of this cave right now, but suddenly his voice fell silent, and the space was filled with drops of blood. Jae-hyun watched in horror as his talkative and slightly annoying brother was pierced through and through by a sword from the monster standing behind him, whose eyes glowed an ominous red light. The man didn't even have time to fully realize what had happened, as blood was already pouring out of his mouth, which meant imminent death, since vital organs were probably affected. Jae-hyun could only stand there dumbfounded and watch as his brother's nearly lifeless body fell limply onto the damp ground of the dungeon. The realization hit the guy's head like an arrow. It suddenly became clear to him that deadly dangerous monsters were hiding in this impenetrable smoke, and he needed to get out of this damned place as soon as possible. The guy, with all his strength, ran away from the place that became fatal for his relative, hoping to escape and get out of this mission alive. When he slowed down a little, he began to replay what had happened in his head, and suddenly realized that those explosions, toxic smoke, and dead people were not just an accident. It was all connected. Having stopped, the guy tried to catch his breath, but he was hampered by the realization that there were forces involved in all of this that were more serious than those he had already encountered. He was almost 100% sure that all this was not done by monsters, but by those who were called dungeon thugs. The main goal of the thugs was to destroy the Meteor Guild. The guy realized that if he went to the exit, he would run into toxic fumes, and killers could be waiting at the entrance, so it was better to stay inside now. Suddenly, Jae-hyun felt such despair inside of him. It seemed so unfair that everything always went so badly for him. But he exhaled, gathered his last strength into a fist, and decided that now was not the time to come apart and shed tears because of his difficult fate. After all, he had found a mythical item, and those who thought he would give up easily were simply unheard of fools. Suddenly, the guy felt someone's insistent presence behind him, as if the power of this person was so enormous that it literally boiled within him. The surrounding world burst into flames, and Jae-hyun stood there in a stupor for a few moments, not knowing what to do. Literally at the last moment, the guy managed to jump away from the chain of fire that the mysterious man standing behind him directed at him. The fire disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and through the ashes that were flying in the air, Jae-hyun tried unsuccessfully to see his attacker. The man's face was hidden by a shadow cast by a deep hood, and the mysterious man said that he knew Hyun would survive his attack. The voice the boy heard was too familiar to be mistaken for anyone else's, so Hyun realized with horror that it was Youngwoo Min, the one he had been waiting for messages from, standing in front of him. What stood before him now was not the respectable man with glasses he had seen in the cafe. At the moment, Youngwoo Min was a man with something crazy shining in his eyes. The man, as if playing, lit a fire in his hand and smilingly told the guy that he had warned him that he would come to the dungeon today. Jae-hyun could only squeeze out one question. Was all these problems really created by his employer, who had chatted so nicely with him over a cup of coffee? Young Woman replied that he was only responsible for the poisonous smoke and the attack on the Meteor Mage Guild. Everything else was a confluence of unfortunate circumstances. After the man answered, he began to laugh suspiciously, which began to raise doubts about the truthfulness of his answer, but now it was not so important. But Jae-hyun was already shocked by what he heard. But he decided not to panic ahead of time and calmly figure out the situation, so he asked why the man did this. The answer was a dismissive wave of the hands and vague words about how this was the request of his sponsor, who clearly did not like the mages from this guild. The guy clenched his teeth in anger, listening to the story about how Meteor was hated by many people because they were disrespectful to other guilds, and thus quickly earned themselves a bad reputation. Jungwoo Min mentioned that the dungeon thugs use the narrow passages of the caves to carry out their dirty deeds without being noticed. With the help of these passages, they managed to carry out illegal, as they called dirty contracts unnoticed. The man said he was confident that the attack on Meteor happened in a blind spot, which is why it was successful. Rubbing his shoulder, bruised as a result of the cave collapse, the guy began to think about the strategy for his further actions. He analyzed his strong opponent and tried to understand whether he could cope with him alone. His intuition and experience told him that it was simply impossible. After all, Chong Woo-min was an A-rank mage, and such strong representatives made up only 2% of the entire population of the country. Jae-hyun was only a D-rank, which made him neither weak nor strong enough to face such an opponent. Suddenly, an unexpected thought came into the guy's head, which suggested that he was not a target for attack, which meant that he just needed to keep his mouth shut. Since the Ashir system was broken, Jae-hyun wasn't even sure if he could escape from this place unharmed. In his worldview, running away was, of course, a dishonest act, but the guy simply didn't see any other option. Of course, he would very much like to avenge all those with whom he fought shoulder to shoulder during today's mission. He especially wanted those who were involved in Myung-ho-hyun's death to pay long and painfully for what they did to his bright brother, who did not deserve such a fate. But looking at Young Woo-min standing in front of him, the guy understood that at the moment, revenge was simply impossible, because no one would feel better if he also lay down in this dungeon. When Jae-hyun said that he would pretend that he hadn't seen anything, he was only thinking that with the appearance of Yggdrasil, the world had become so cruel that there was no longer room for the weak. Hyun wanted to continue persuading his opponent to let him go in exchange for silence, but Young Woo-min irritably cut off the guy's speech. The man didn't say anything, but from the way the surrounding world was filled with fire again, it was clear that he didn't like the guy's plan. Apparently, the magician had his own vision of the situation. Young Woo-min concentrated all his energy and directed it straight at Jae-hyun, hoping that this time, not even ashes would be left of him. The guy realized that this time the attack was stronger than the previous one, so he quickly covered himself from the fire and jumped back to a safe distance in time. He felt a trickle of blood slowly running down his cheek, and at that moment the boy realized that if he had reacted just a second later, he would have turned into a charred corpse. When Young Woo-min saw the blood he had drawn from his enemy, he smiled madly, as if he had sensed his opponent's weakness, and was now ready to strike with renewed vigor. Laughing like a mental patient, The man said that the target for elimination was not only the Meteor Guild, after which he looked meaningfully at Hyun. The Mad Mage left the sentence unfinished so the boy could figure out the meaning himself. Then, without wasting any time, he put his hand forward and attacked again, directing a wall of fire at his former employee. Jae-hyun was luckier than ever today, as he was once again able to dodge the napalm that was aimed straight at him in just the right moment. And although the guy was not harmed by the fire, he was still wounded, as evidenced by the blood running down his hand and face. It was the lesser evil that could happen to him, but still, his strength was slowly leaving him, and he understood that he needed to get away from here urgently. When the mage attacked the guy with a fire spiral once again, Jae-hyun thought about why he needed a simple D-rank raider who did not pose a strong threat. At this time, Jung-woo-min created 3 more fire spheres, which, with the first wave of his hand, would fly towards Hyun and would try to burn through him. Clutching his bloody throat with his hand, Hyun thought only about what he had done that such powerful opponents wanted him dead. The guy began to diligently go through in his head all the potential enemies he had ever crossed, and who might want to kill him. Suddenly he remembered the persistent whispers he had heard before entering the dungeon, insisting that the boy was trash and his life was worthless. The realization struck Jae-hyun like lightning, and now his head was filled with guesses about who could possibly want him dead. He asked Chung Woo-min if it was really his father, and this question left the magician stunned, because the man did not know what to answer. There was a tense silence in the air, and it seemed that even the fiery spheres had fallen silent, waiting for what would happen next. Jung Woo-min was so unprepared to hear Hyun's suggestion that he even covered his mouth with his hand in surprise, so as not to blurt out anything unnecessary. But then the magician burst into a mad laugh, which had already become so familiar to the guy, and did not answer the question asked about Hyun's father's involvement in this matter. Jung Woo-min began to evade the question, saying that Jae-hyun was a good guy and he liked him, but he had an order that he needed to fulfill. Everything became clear to the guy, and this realization burned inside much more than the burns from the magician's fire spheres, because it's not every day you find out that your own father wants you dead. He remembered the photo of his mother, which he kept even on his phone and looked at before dangerous tasks, as if his mother was able to protect him even in this way. A thought came into his head that didn't give him any peace, and he asked if he could ask one more question. Images of days gone by flashed before Hyun's eyes, namely his mother's dead body lying on a cold table in the morgue, covered only by white sheets. He remembered how he cried so hard when he learned that his only close and beloved person was deprived of life, and he would never again be able to hug her or smell her familiar scent. Jae-hyun asked if it was really true that in the winter, 5 years ago, his mother was also killed on the orders of this vile man who called himself his father. Jung Woo-min responded in surprise that he didn't think that the guy would be able to put everything together and guess the true reasons for his mother's death. Suddenly, the mad magician's eyes widened in admiration, and he said that the guy had simply amazing thinking skills to be able to understand everything. Hyun looked at the man standing in front of him and didn't understand how, when he had talked to him before, he hadn't noticed that Jung Woo-min was simply insane. But what was even more incomprehensible to the guy was how he could have done this to his wife, and now also intend to kill his own son. In response, the mage sent only a new volley of fire, but after all these discoveries, Jae-hyun was so indifferent that he did not even flinch from the new attack. Jung Woo-min smiled kindly and said that this was all too much, so it was necessary to end this battle. But by this phrase, the man did not mean that he would let the guy go alive. He hinted at a quicker reprisal, so he formed several more chains of fire. When Hyun heard the man begin to say goodbye to him, he realized that he needed to take action now, otherwise it might be too late, and he would allow his father to win. Suddenly, an image of the object he found in the hidden room flashed in his mind. Odin's eyes seemed to hint at the boy to use it. Seeing Hyun's confusion, Jung Woo-min became even more excited and jokingly began to ask if the guy wanted to say anything before leaving. But all the fun was cut short when the man saw that the guy began to fill with some kind of incomprehensible and very powerful energy that was capable of destroying everything around him. Chung Woo-min was seriously scared because he didn't expect to be given any resistance. He expected a quick and cleanly closed case. And here in front of him stood a guy who made the entire dungeon tremble with his power, which the man had not even suspected before. The presence of this energy became stronger and stronger, and the magician did not even know how to understand it all and what to do next. Jung Woo-min concluded that he needed to finish this guy off quickly because he had a bad feeling about what would happen next. He created another chain of fire, and this time he put the rest of his power into it, saying that now the jokes were over and this time Hyun had to die. The fire was increasingly enveloping Jae-hyun, intending to leave not even bones behind. But the boy stood and did not move at all, as if the remnants of his fear had died in him. After hearing the news, a flame was seething inside the guy, which was much worse than what the magician sent at him. Hyun opened his eyes, which glowed with cold rage. But in addition to this, a fire flared up in them, which was ready to avenge all the loved ones who died due to the fault of his father. The flame, which was getting closer, was stopped by huge shadow claws, which did not allow it to get to the guy. Seeing this, Jung Woo-min was simply astonished and could not utter a word, because before he had never seen anyone possess such powers. Jae-hyun also didn't expect that anything could save him from this stream of fire. He was so shocked that his face couldn't show a single emotion. Suddenly, a tablet appeared, the information on which stated that the item Odin's Lost Eye was used, and since it was assigned to the user, Hyun would not be able to sell it for money. The guy was thinking about the fact that he had another empty card, when suddenly he was distracted from his thoughts by the shrill cry of Jung Woo-min, who could not come to terms with the loss. The powerful but insane mage could not understand what was happening and why his magic seemed to dissipate, and did not inflict the necessary damage on the enemy. Jae-hyun stepped forward and said in a cold, rough voice that he would finish the man off in the most brutal way possible, after which his blank card was absorbed. The guy's eyes widened as he felt a powerful force growing inside him that was capable of demolishing the entire dungeon along with the magician. The information that was displayed in front of him was that an active skill called Super Speed Chain had been created. After that, fire spheres began to swirl around Hyun, which were similar to those created by Jung Woo-min, but there were more of them, and they felt much more powerful. The magician stood and blinked his eyes in surprise, his mouth open, because he couldn't understand how the raider, who owned rank D, had the Super Speed Chain. Looking at how skillfully the boy managed to create a chain, the man indignantly remembered that it took him years to master this complex spell. Jung Woo-min gritted his teeth in anger and said that he didn't care how the guy managed to learn the highest spell, but he still didn't have a single chance to stand against the A-rank mage. Hyun ignored his opponent's provocative tone and said that they had to fight to see who would win. After these words, huge fiery tentacles stretched out towards the magician, which were just trying to accuse the enemy's body. Hyun's firepower was simply astounding in its power. It seemed that he didn't need any rest or respite between attacks, because the streams of fire hit one after another. One of the strikes from the high-speed chain landed right under Jung Woo-min's feet. If he hadn't pulled his limb back in time, it would have been fried right there. Jae-hyun watched with absolute indifference as he sent more and more streams of fire at his opponent, because after hearing this, he only wanted to kill this bastard. The man, who just a couple of minutes ago was laughing, enjoying his triumph, was now running from one place to another, trying to hide from the enemy's attacks. When he had a small respite, Jung Woo-min took advantage of that short moment and created a fire sphere from the remaining strength of his body. The mage made another attempt to attack Jae-hyun and directed a stream of his power towards where his enemy stood. Hyun's eyes widened again, and information appeared before his eyes, stating that the skill Absolute Calculation was being activated. Thanks to this technique, the super-fast fire chain moved with incredible precision and was now heading straight for Jung Woo-min. The man also understood that this blow would be much more difficult to avoid than all the previous ones put together, so he clenched his teeth from the tension. He put his hand forward, and a blue shield appeared in front of him, which protected him and did not allow the fire to reach the magician's body. This maneuver only made Jae-hyun even more angry and fueled his thirst for revenge for all those who died because of Jung Woo-min and the one who gave him orders. The boy activated his skill called Absolute Calculation again, intending to destroy the armor the mage had put up, and after a couple of seconds of effort, he succeeded. Jung Woo-min couldn't believe that someone was able to break his magical defense, because before this, he thought it was simply impossible. The man looked with fear at the approaching chain of fire and understood that this time he would not be able to dodge, and it threatened to end in certain death for him. Jae-hyun watched with cold pleasure as his power hit its target, and finally crushed the opponent who had caused him so much trouble. When the aftermath of the impact began to dissipate a little, and the cave space became visible through the dust and rocks, Hyun moved closer to the impact site to see the result of his actions. The first thing that caught his eye was the broken glasses and the convulsively trembling hand of the once self-confident opponent who had boasted of his abilities. Jung Woo-min lay on the floor of the cave and coughed violently, spitting out more and more blood. It was clear that he was living out his last minutes. The dying man opened his tear-filled eyes and looked at his executioner with a bleary gaze, begging for mercy. But Hyun thought that when his mother begged for mercy, no one listened to her, and these thoughts helped him quickly create a chain of fire, which became the last thing the magician saw. When his power had served its purpose and was hidden in the depths of his body, blood began to flow from the corners of Hyun's lips, and he suddenly realized that it was all over. It seemed that after this thought, the guy completely ran out of strength, and he helplessly collapsed onto the stone floor of the cave, not far from the bloody corpse of young Woo Min. The boy looked helplessly at the ceiling of the cave and realized that he had no more stamina or mana left, which he had used in the battle. His eyes closed by themselves, and he caught himself thinking that he hadn't thought about such a strange end to his life, because the guy didn't want to leave this world immediately after a successful find. Jahyun thought ironically that Death was a girlfriend that the raider couldn't help but show up for a date with, and she turned out to be surprisingly cold. After these thoughts, the guy wanted to smile, but he didn't have the strength even for that, so he closed his eyes and sank into oblivion. But a moment later, he was awakened by the Ashir system, which offered to install a new control system in which the user moves to a point in the past to which he wants to return. Jaehyun was surprised to realize that he had a chance to be saved if he traveled to the past. This was another strange change in the system. Trying not to think about whether luck or tragedy would happen to him, the guy said to launch a new system, because it seemed like the only solution. The familiar blue screen became covered with red pixels, and a notification appeared that a new system called Nornir was being launched. Images of beautiful girls illuminated by bright light appeared in the guy's head. Some of them had wings, and he immediately remembered the legends of the Valkyries. They spoke to him in a gentle voice, but Hyun could not pick out a word, because their speech was in some ancient language, the meaning of which he did not know. One of them came up close to the guy, so that he could see how her golden curls shimmered in the light, and extended her hand, and Hyun extended his in response. After that, the system gave out information that the gods of Asir were now watching him, because he had become their enemy, and had the passive skills attracted the attention of the gods and eye of the absolute god. Before this information had time to reach Jaehyun's fevered mind, he woke up and began to frantically suck in air, trying to figure out where he was. He sat up in bed and began to look around, trying to remember how he ended up in this room and what happened after he lost consciousness. When his gaze fell on the desk that stood in the room, he began to look more closely, and, having noted some details, the guy became completely confused about what was happening. He was especially confused by the photo with his mother, in which he was still a teenager, because Jaehyun had not seen her for many years. The guy began to look at his hands and try to figure out what happened after he touched the beautiful Valkyrie from his vision. For a while he simply looked at his empty palms, but then a spark of power lit up in them, which became more and more powerful, and then information appeared before his eyes that he had successfully returned to the past. Jaehyun instantly remembered that the installation of the new system foreshadowed that he would have the ability to return to any point in his past, and this realization struck him. He remembered all the suffering he had experienced in his life, the loss of loved ones that he would have liked to avoid, and there was only one question in his head. Was he dreaming all of this? Jaehyun looked in shock at the familiar room that had suddenly become alien to him after his mother's death, and couldn't believe that he was here again. But when he saw his mother entering the house, he completely lost touch with reality, because if this was all a dream, then he didn't want to wake up. The mother looked at Jaehyun with her brown eyes, which always had a copper tint in the sun, and the boy was completely speechless. He couldn't put two words together, because tears involuntarily began to flow down his cheeks, but words were unnecessary at that moment, because he just wanted to feel his loved one nearby. The guy ran up to his mother and hugged her so tightly that the woman widened her eyes in surprise and barely stayed on her feet. Feeling such a familiar scent, Hyun wanted to dissolve in these embraces and never let go of his mother again, so as not to see her on a cold table in the morgue again. Hyun saw a system notification in front of his eyes that the time travel had been completed, and the current date was November 15th, 2020. He coughed, feeling pain in his chest, and saw another message, which said that the user's body had been restricted and was only 20% restored. The guy felt like he was still in some strange dream, but looking around he realized that he recognized the apartment he was in because he had lived in it before. He received a new notification from the Nornir system, which said that there was a quest called Rest, in which he needed to restore his stamina to 80%, and then he would have one empty card. Jaehyun looked at this information and couldn't fully comprehend that the Ashir system he had known since childhood was no longer there, and now he was playing by new rules. He sighed heavily, but decided not to despair ahead of time, because he still had a lot to figure out. What worried him the most was the reason why he didn't die when he fell to the ground exhausted after the battle with Jung Woo Min in the dungeon. It seemed like the new system was capable of a lot, since it sent him back to the past, but such twists and turns wouldn't surprise Hyun, since many strange things had happened in his life. He decided that if what happened could give him new knowledge, then he would be able to skillfully adapt to similar situations in the future. The guy began to analyze the fact that the system had moved him back 11 years, which meant that now he should be in the middle class in his third year of study. He also noted that the control system had changed its name and was now called Nornir. Jaehyun slowly got out of bed and decided to look around, but when his feet touched the floor, he realized that what was happening still seemed like a dream to him. The guy finally stood up and headed to his desk, where everything was the same as 11 years ago. There was a slight chaos that did not interfere with finding what he needed. He picked up the calendar in which he always left notes and realized that no matter what happened, he was absolutely sure of one thing. This was an opportunity he couldn't miss, so he glanced at the note that read, "Choose martial arts to study at Males Academy," and crossed it out with a confident movement. Hyun knew that the combat class hadn't given him the future he wanted, and now that he had the chance to fix it, he would do his best to become a mage. Sitting at breakfast and chewing on the rice his mother had cooked, the boy felt a little uneasy because the memories of the dead body of the woman who was now sitting opposite him were fresh in his mind. The mother looked at her son with her warm, caring eyes and felt uneasy because something was clearly bothering her boy and giving him no peace. She looked at Hyun, who was almost crying, and couldn't understand what had happened, because her son had always been very stoic, but now he didn't seem like himself. The mother could not look at her son in such a state, so she asked what was happening and why he stood up in such a bad mood. Jaehyun put on his most carefree expression and laughed, saying that he was fine and that the reason for his behavior was a very realistic nightmare. It was clear that his mother didn't really believe this hastily concocted excuse, but Hyun couldn't say that when he looked at her, he remembered a corpse covered with white sheets. Jaehyun muttered that he wanted to tell his mother something, and she smiled, saying that she felt that her son was keeping quiet about something. She looked at Hyun with her piercing eyes that were exactly the same as her son's and thought that perhaps he was afraid of entering Milas Academy. The woman reflected on the fact that the profession of a raider was very dangerous, and the competition among them was quite serious, so her worries were quite justified. The mother closed her eyes and decided that the happiness and well-being of her child was important to her, so if her son did not want to go to Milas, then he should continue his education in a regular school. She decided that even though Milas was a prestigious academy, if Hyun didn't want to go there, then so be it. But she never expected to hear that he was thinking of transferring to the magic department. When the woman heard this, she felt relieved and smiled at her own thoughts, because it was important to her that her son choose his own path. So if he wants to be a magician, let him become one. But when the meaning of what was said finally reached her, she was surprised, because her son had always said that he would choose the warrior class. The woman was sure that Hyun was a thoughtful guy and would not change his decision without a reason, so she gently touched his cheek, wanting to ask about the reasons for such a decision. But then she decided that if her son wanted, he would tell her everything later, so she asked him if he was sure of his decision. And when her son answered that he had weighed everything, she felt calmer. She said that in that case, let him do as he sees fit, but reminded him that she would like her son to think not about money, but about what he will do in life. She continued to stroke her son's cheek and say that the most important thing in life was to find your calling, and seeing how Hyun's face became sadder, she said that she would support him in any case. Jaehyun couldn't take it anymore and started crying. His mother said that now was not the time for tears, but she didn't understand how much he missed this warmth and love after she died. The boy came to the realization that if he wanted to take revenge on his father, who was an A-rank raider, he had to become a strong magician capable of protecting his family. When Jaehyun was developing his stamina through exercise, the system reported that the rest quest had been completed, and the reward, an empty card, had been received. The guy finished training and thought that the new Nornir system suited him quite well because it gave good quests and rewards. He looked at the information window and understood that while it was unclear what kind of material this system was made of, it was quite possible to get some benefit from it. The guy began to think about the fact that he knew the future. He knew both the hidden parts and the ruins that he could capture. He had a good memory, so overall, there were enough advantages. The main problem was his abilities, because other than the skills Absolute Calculation and Super Speed Chain, he only had combat class skills in his arsenal. He plopped down tiredly into a chair, and thought that there was nothing surprising about this, because all his life he wanted to become a warrior, not a magician, so he needed to develop new abilities. Jae-hyun opened the information window and decided to look at his characteristics, which had dropped a little, and his level also left much to be desired. But what caught his attention was that the passive skills remained at the same level, which was explained in the system by the fact that this was all because of the new skill attracted the attention of the gods. The guy became interested in learning more about this skill, and the system gave out information that it was a divine blessing that accelerates the user's development and increases characteristics at a new level. Hyun became curious about what it meant to him that the gods were watching him and how it would affect his other skills. The guy began to examine his other skills and came to the conclusion that it was not very clear what the eye of the absolute god was for, but the super speed chain was a very serious toy. Looking at his physical characteristics, Jae-hyun realized that for a mage, strength was not so important, but agility would never be superfluous, and he had nothing to say about mana. But victory loves preparation and endurance, so it was possible to improve these characteristics. You just have to put in enough effort. They, unlike mana and strength, did not increase combat power, but increased the fatigue threshold in the case when the same action was performed repeatedly. The guy understood that if he invested in endurance now, the effect would be felt at every new level. When Jae-hyun more or less understood the strategy of his further actions, he had a question about what he should study to gain new knowledge. Looking at the card he received as a quest reward, Hyun thought that the super speed chain would be enough to attack for now, and he wouldn't be able to use complex spells due to the lack of mana, so healing was all that was left. Jae-hyun remembered that it was 2020, which meant that mages were treated like trash and were not valued at all. But if the raider had some kind of healing skill, then their attractiveness would increase dramatically, and their position in society would improve. Such guys were always valued, and for this, it was not necessary to be a raider. You could go into medicine or somewhere where the skills of a healer are in demand. Hyun turned the blank card over in his hands and realized that in order to raise his authority, he needed to learn how to heal. The guy leaned back in his chair and sighed with concern, because the problem was that meeting an awakened one with such skills was not an easy task. In addition, the fight with the crazy young Woo Min showed that one should use empty cards as wisely as possible, and not waste them in vain. Jae-hyun closed his eyes and thought that it was unknown exactly how many cards the system would give out, but it was clear that it wouldn't throw them around left and right. The guy was distracted from his thoughts by a call on his mobile phone. He wondered who was bothering him, since his social circle had changed a lot during all this time. He was very surprised when he saw that it was Kim Yoo-jung calling him, because it seemed like these names were familiar to him from some distant past life. They had been friends with this girl since childhood, because they lived in the same area, so they often walked and spent a lot of time together. Kim Yoo-jung, like Hyun, also dreamed of entering Millis Academy and becoming a respected raider. But this bright girl never managed to realize all her planned wishes, because something irreparable happened. Jae-hyun had a flashback of Kim lying bloodied in his arms, dying, and him being unable to do anything to help her. Memories came flooding back to the boy, and he couldn't get rid of them. But then he told himself that everything would be okay, because now he had a chance to change the future. Jae-hyun looked at his phone, where notifications from Kim Yoo-jung were coming one after another, and realized that the girl remained the same as he remembered her. She was very restless, and this time she suggested going to a lecture that Yoo Sun-un would give in the city center. Kim tried in every possible way to persuade the guy to go there. Hyun racked his brain and remembered that Yoo Sun-un was a holy maiden who was highly revered in their hometown, so her lectures were always crowded. She was also popular because her magic embodied the power of sacrifice, and people loved to seek out such heroes and honor them. Jae-hyun decided that he needed to get used to living in this new reality, so he needed to meet up with old acquaintances and make new connections, so there was nothing to worry about. The guy threw on a sweatshirt that he hadn't seen for 11 years, and it seemed to him that with this thing, he returned to the appearance of his past self. Hyun went into the kitchen and told his mother that he would go out for a while. It was very unusual for him to hear her admonition to come back while it was still light, because he hadn't heard such words for so long. The guy smiled, because he knew that now there were people who cared whether he was alive or not, So with joyful anticipation, he answered his old friend that he would now join her. At this time, a solid black car was racing through the city, carrying a special and highly respected person. The personal driver informed Yoo Sun-yoon of her schedule, as she had to give a lecture to the raiders in the city center, and then go on a raid in the B-rank dungeon in the Seongbuk district. The man said that after all this they were expected in Wonju, and then there was a flight to the USA. Looking at the woman in the rearview mirror, the driver doubted that she would cope with all this in such a state. He told the chairwoman in a tense voice that her health had deteriorated, and that this could affect her productivity. Yoo Sun-yoon smiled and replied that nothing serious had happened to her. It was just a simple lack of sleep that would pass as soon as she got a good rest. But the personal assistant paid no attention to all these excuses and said that she knew that the sacrifice was taking her own life. The man looked ahead sullenly and thought that if someone else had such a skill, it would be possible to cure the chairman. The woman smiled even wider and reminded her assistant, whose name was Park Sung-jae, that they had agreed not to talk about it. Park Sung-jae fell silent because he understood that these empty conversations would lead to nothing, but would only irritate the woman before important events. But he thought to himself that if this continued, the Holy Virgin of South Korea might soon leave this world. When Jaehyun finally met Kim, the girl immediately grabbed his hand and enthusiastically led him straight into the crowd, because there was a real crush in the city center. This kind of activity was now unusual for the guy, so he told his girlfriend with a little irritation to stop pulling him by the hand. The girl slowed down her pace a little, but still didn't let go of Hyun's hand, so he could only watch as she looked around curiously, hoping to see Yoo Sun-yoon. Wanting to defuse the situation, the guy asked his girlfriend if she had invited him only because she was afraid of getting lost in this crowd. Kim Yoo-jen looked at her friend indignantly and said that it was not true, but the guy did not believe her and asked her to let go of his hand if he was wrong. The girl didn't answer, but she squeezed Hyun's wrist even tighter, which only made him smile wider because he was absolutely right. Jae-hyun asked his friend in a sickeningly caring voice why an excellent student and outstanding athlete forgot the way every day. In response, the girl hissed that thanks to her, he would listen to the lecture. The guy didn't deny it, but just smiled and said that Kim was absolutely right about this, especially since he wasn't at all against seeing Yoo Sun-yoon in person. When he arrived at the conference venue, Hyun thought that it would be a good idea to copy Yoo Sun-yoon's magic of sacrifice, as it could be useful for establishing connections in South Korea. The guys took their seats and began to wait for the lecture to begin, and while the guys sat with an absolutely indifferent face, Kim simply beamed with anticipation. Hyun understood that this person possessed simply unique magical power, but he still could not understand why people were simply obsessed with her. Yoo Sun-yoon was called the Holy Maiden. She was the master of the Lotus Guild, and her fame extended not only to Korea, she was equally popular overseas. At a time when raiding was not as widespread as it is now, the Holy Virgin fought in the front lines, while simultaneously treating the wounded. The crowd's attention was drawn to the sound of a hand tapping on the microphone, signaling the beginning of the lecture that everyone present had been eagerly awaiting. The Holy Virgin took the microphone and greeted the people present, after which she introduced herself as if everyone in the city center did not know her. The crowd exploded with excited shouts and responses to this greeting. People began waving their hands at her, hoping that she would pay attention to them. The guy sat silently and watched the woman intently, because he knew what would happen to this universal favorite. A couple of months later, when Yoo Sun-yoon goes to Itaewon for another raid, her condition suddenly worsens. And although there was no official information, Hyun knew that the reason for this was the magic of sacrifice, which took away part of the owner's life energy, and there was only one way to help her. Knowing what would happen to the woman standing on stage, Jae-hyun felt uncomfortable watching everyone's excitement, even though he knew that people knew nothing about her condition. Yoo Sun-yoon began her lecture by saying that the world is currently experiencing an era of disasters and decline. So many people have experienced difficulties in their lives. She said that after the sacred tree Yggdrasil appeared, many citizens gave their lives in the fight against the invasion of bloodthirsty monsters. Hyun noticed that Kim was listening with delight to the story about how the situation had improved significantly since the first raids and awakened people appeared. The lecturer said that of the currently living awakened, only a fifth were ready to join the ranks of the raiders and defend humanity at the cost of their own lives. The woman made her voice more serious and said that their future was not yet determined, because the struggle for existence continues to this day, as people are dying even now because of monsters. Yoo Sun-yoon said that this world needs the courage of all the awakened, so they must be brave and fight the common enemy. She bowed to her audience and called on all conscientious citizens to enlist in her guild and fight for world peace. To the admiring cheers of the crowd, she said that her guild called Lotus would help people with the determination if necessary. The woman was ready to provide all the necessary support. Kim Yoo-jung was so moved by the speech that was given at the lecture that she could not contain her admiration for Yoo Sun-yoon and her dedication to her work. Jae-hyun understood that both Kim and Yoo Sun-yoon were right in that they needed to encourage people to fight, since most of the awakened were afraid of raiding, since fighting monsters was not an easy task. The guy absent-mindedly scratched the back of his head and remembered that before the time jump, he was going to sell Odin's eye to end all these battles and live in peace and prosperity. Lost in his own thoughts, Hyun could barely hear his friend's thoughts about how Yoo Sun-yoon had the right to become a role model, but he doubted that the woman would like that. After that, the guy said that he had plans, and after the lecture he needed to drop by one place, to which Kim irritably said, would he really leave her alone among such a crowd of people? Hyun reminded the girl with a smirk that she said she didn't suffer from topographic cretinism. In response, Kim muttered that he liked to make fun of her too much. Jae-hyun smiled even wider and said that he was just joking, he wouldn't leave her alone, so he called Kim Yoo-jung's mother, who would be here soon. But these words seemed to cause even more anxiety in Eugene, because she began to persuade her friend to wait for her mother, and she would give him a ride to where he needed to go. As he was leaving, the guy turned around and told the girl that he had chosen a magic class instead of a combat class, and would now be learning the basics of magic rather than physical combat techniques. Looking at his friend's confused face, the guy said that he would somehow teach her magic, and starting with theory, they would master the basics step by step, but Eugene said that she didn't need it. The girl watched her best friend blend into the crowd and, confused, demanded that he explain why he had changed classes before going about his important business. She looked at Jae-hyun leaving and was in despair because he left her alone and even did not share the details of such an important decision, and they were planning to study in the combat class together. Hyun was finally able to escape his girlfriend's excessive attention and now looked around because he remembered that Yoo Sun-yoon went to this side of the street. Turning off a busy street, the guy saw an expensive car and a security guard standing nearby. All of this indicated that the woman would soon arrive here. When Hyun came closer, the personal assistant said that he apologized, but the chairman did not accept gifts at this time. The guy put on a mask of absolute friendliness, smiled, and said that he came here to see Miss Yoo Sun-yoon. Park Sung-jae rolled his eyes tiredly and decided that in front of him stood yet another fanatic, who was completely obsessed with raiding and joining the Lotus Order. The man addressed the boy seriously, saying that his decision to join the raiders was commendable, but that he shouldn't so unceremoniously invade other people's personal space. Tired of listening to the assistant talk about how he was putting Yoo Sun-yoon in an awkward position once again, Hyun interrupted him and told him to listen to him. Continuing to smile sweetly, the guy told Sung-jae Oppa that he knew that the chairman was terminally ill and nothing could help her with this illness. Seeing the man's confused look, Hyun said that he had not come to threaten to reveal the woman's secret, but to help since he was able to cure her. This news shocked the personal assistant and took away the ability to speak, because they had been trying for a long time to find at least some way to improve Yoo Sun-yoon's condition. The man was simply furious at the impudence of this boy, because they had so carefully concealed the chairman's health condition. He grabbed the guy and began asking where he got this information from. Seeing that his action did not have the desired effect and the guy did not show any reaction, Park Sung-jae asked in an even more threatening tone, because it was necessary to find out the source of the information leak. Hyun said in a completely calm tone that there was no need to shout about the chairman's illness to the whole street, because they might attract unnecessary attention to their conversation. Indeed, people passing by had already begun to pay attention to the strange couple, who were talking in raised tones and seemed not averse to getting into a fight. Suddenly, the rear window of the car rolled down, and Yoo Sun-yoon's face appeared, ordering her assistant to wait before jumping to conclusions and listen to what the guy had to say first. She looked straight at Hyun with her piercing eyes and asked him if he was able to take responsibility for his words. Jae-hyun casually shrugged off Sung-jae Oppa's hand and smirked, saying that he took full responsibility for saying and repeating what could cure the woman. Yoo Sun-yoon closed her eyes and thought that if what he said was a lie, the guy would have been exposed immediately, but he was acting surprisingly confident. She looked at this strange guy who appeared out of nowhere and offered what she wanted so badly and wondered if she had anything to rely on. The woman asked Sung-jae Oppa how much time they had left before leaving this city, and after hearing that they only had 2 hours, she began to think about what to do next. Deciding that she should give this guy a chance, since she would regret not trying later, Madam Chairman said that it would be better for them to talk in a quiet place, so she suggested that Hyun get into the car. When they arrived at their destination, and there were no prying ears around, Yoo Sun-yoon sat down in a chair and invited the guy to sit opposite her. Jae-hyun thanked the woman and obediently settled into the next chair, preparing for a thorough conversation. The lady chairwoman folded her hands seriously and asked how the guy knew about her illness, because you don't hear this information at every step. Hyun apologized, but firmly said that he could not share this information, because if he did, he would not be involved in her treatment. To the guy's surprise, Yoo Sun-yoon laughed and, calling him too impudent, said that she agreed to these conditions and would not ask about the source of the information. She asked how the treatment would be carried out and what was needed for it, and Hyun began to think about how he could most gently communicate his plan. Deciding that the best way to build trust between them would be to be direct, he told the woman without further ado that he was going to copy her skill of sacrifice. Yoo Sun-yoon didn't expect to hear this at all and didn't immediately come up with an answer because she needed to digest what the mysterious young man had said. Just then, Park Sung-jae arrived, slamming his hand on the table aggressively and shouting that the chairman shouldn't listen to this useless charlatan. The man angrily asked if he had even the slightest idea what the sacrifice skill was, since it was a unique ability that couldn't be simply copied. Hyun listened with an indifferent face to the chairman's assistant's stream of questions about how he was going to copy magic, the formula of which he didn't even fully understand. This unique ability was one step higher than C-rank skills, and was the so-called skill ceiling, and could be obtained either from ancestors or by self-discovery. Normal spells could be learned through formulas, but the formula for a unique spell could not be understood, so the ability could not be copied. Hearing all this, Hyun said that this was information that everyone knew, but for now, he suggested not to get excited, because if he couldn't help, he wouldn't even come. Hearing these self-confident words, Park Sung-jae became even more furious because the insolence was coming from this young man, but the chairwoman said that they would hear him out. The woman asked if she understood correctly that the guy wanted to heal her using her own sacrifice skill. Hyun answered in the affirmative, and thought that in order to heal the wound received due to the spell usage penalty, a healing of a higher rank, or the same as the spell itself, was needed. He analyzed that the cause of Yoo Sun-yoon's illness was her unique skill. There was no treatment of a higher rank, and the woman could not heal herself, so his option was the only one. Sacrifice meant offering a gift to a god, so Yoo Seon-yoon was under a restriction that prevented her from healing herself. This absurd prohibition was because, according to the logic of the gods, one cannot sacrifice one's life for the sake of one's own life. The woman was silent for a moment, then smiled warmly and said that since Jae-hyun claimed that this was the only solution, she would try his option. The space around Yoo Sun-yoon suddenly lit up with a warm light that enveloped everything around her, and she asked the guy to prove that he could help her. Seeing that the chairwoman had decided to agree to the guy's adventure, Park Sung-jae shouted at her to think again about what she was doing and what the consequences were. But the head of the Lotus Guild did not stop, but on the contrary, concentrated even more and materialized her power in the form of a bright light, which she now held in her palms. Jae-hyun watched with satisfaction as the events unfolded, smiling as he thought that the plan was going like clockwork, and that soon he would have the power of sacrifice in his arsenal. The boy materialized the empty card that the Nornir system gave him as a reward for completing the task, so that it would absorb the new skill. Jae-hyun allowed the system to use the card to record the sacrifice skill in order to learn this new spell later. The guy's eyes flashed, and he felt how power began to boil in his veins, and his body was filled with new, as yet unexplored energy. After that, Hyun said that he saw mistrust in the eyes of his interlocutors, so he promised to do everything so that they would begin to trust him. To back up his words with actions, the boy decided to demonstrate the new skill he now possessed, thanks to the blank card and the power of Yoo Seon-yoon. The fact that he managed to light the sacrificial light was an incredible surprise to both Sung-jae Oppa and the chairwoman, as they had not even known that such a thing was possible before. Seeing the shocked faces of his interlocutors, the guy clenched his fist, drawing all his strength back, and offered to begin trying to heal the woman. An information window appeared before Hyun's eyes, stating that he now had a unique skill that created a healing wave that had various effects. The guy was thinking that since the spell was cast using a blank card, there was no penalty, but he was distracted from his thoughts by the voice of a woman who asked what he wanted from the guild. Although Yu Sun-yoon asked this question, she thought to herself that just being able to cure her illness was already enough for negotiations. Looking at Jae-hyun, she realized that he was an ordinary kid from middle school, so it was very surprising that he had the ability to copy the skills of others. Also, the woman was amused by the fact that this young man was so impudent that he directly declared the negotiations to the chairman. She was very interested in what would happen next. Jae-hyun said that he wanted something not specifically from the guild, but from Yu Sung-gun, or rather, he would be happy if she became his sponsor. The woman even coughed in surprise and asked if he really wanted her help in achieving success in the raid. The guy looked at the woman and said that it was his dream to succeed in raiding, but for rapid growth he needed money and connections, so he asked for her support. After thinking for a moment, Yu Sun-yoon said that she agreed to help him because she saw in him courage and sufficient potential for such investments. Jae-hyun smiled with satisfaction when he heard the holy maiden say that he was not lacking in ability, and she also liked his approach to negotiations. But then the woman narrowed her eyes and said that she would also have some conditions that he would have to fulfill without fail. The guy found this strange because for Yu Sun-yoon, he was the only hope for recovery, so she should be in a desperate situation. Seeing that despite all the difficulties, the woman did not lose her composure, Hyun respectfully asked what kind of professional conditions these were. The guild leader said that as far as he knew, her illness was a personal matter and had nothing to do with Lotus. And Jae-hyun will need not only her support as the leader, but also connections with the entire guild as a whole. The guy caught the woman's thought and realized that she was talking about helping him without any reason. She was talking about unfair treatment, so he asked what she was proposing. Hyun knew that he would always have the option to refuse if he wasn't satisfied with something, so in that case, Yu Sun-yoon would lose much more than he would, and she also had no leverage to manipulate.